The question that would end a career hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle, waiting for the right wind to ignite everything around it. It hadn't been asked yet wouldn't be for another 17 minutes, but the woman sitting alone at the corner table in the Coronado Officers Club already knew it was coming. She could feel it building in the laughter across the room, in the sideways glances, in the way the group of SEALs had been studying her for the past 10 minutes, like she was a puzzle they couldn't quite solve. She took another sip of her black coffee, her movements precise and economical, betraying nothing of the storm that was about to break. Her name was Alex Chen, though that wasn't the name that mattered. The name that mattered was buried so deep in classified files that most people who knew it thought it was a myth. To the men across the room, she was just another anomaly, a woman in civilian clothes who'd somehow wandered into their sacred space, their temple of testosterone and tactical superiority. They had no idea they were about to poke a ghost. The Coronado Officers Club at 1,847 hours on a Tuesday was exactly what you'd expect. A collection of the Navy's finest, unwinding after another day of training the world's most elite warriors. The walls were lined with photographs of SEAL teams past and present, their faces stern and professional, eyes that had seen things most people only experienced in nightmares. The air hung thick with the scent of leather, bourbon, and something indefinable that might have been confidence or might have been arrogance in this crowd. The line between them was razor thin. Alex had chosen her seat deliberately. Back to the wall, clear view of all entrances, close enough to the emergency exit to matter, but far enough from the main traffic flow to avoid unwanted attention. Old habits. Her civilian clothes, dark jeans, simple black sweater, minimal jewelry were carefully selected to make her invisible. In a room full of uniforms and egos, anonymity was camouflage. But invisibility, she was learning, had its limits. "Check out the lost tourist," came the first voice, pitched, just loud enough to carry across the room's ambient noise. It belonged to a mountain of a man whose chest looked like it could stop bullets even without body armor. His name tape read Morrison, and the trident on his uniform marked him as one of the Brotherhood. The comment drew chuckles from his table. 4 SEALs in their desert utilities, fresh from what looked like a training evolution. Sand still clung to their boots. And there was that particular kind of exhaustion that came from a day of pushing human limits. They were riding the high that followed surviving something that would break lesser men, and that high made them feel invincible. It also made them careless. "Maybe she's waiting for her husband," suggested another SEAL. This one younger, with lieutenant's bars and the kind of confidence that hadn't been tested by real failure yet. "Probably got lost looking for the main club. Or she's one of those base groupies," Morrison added, his voice dripping with casual dismissal. "You know the type, hangs around military guys, collects war stories, thinks proximity to the uniform makes her special." Alex's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around her coffee cup. She'd heard variations of this conversation 100 times before, in a dozen different countries, in places where her presence had been questioned, not because of security concerns but because of assumptions. The word stung not because they were particularly creative. She'd heard much worse, but because of their casual cruelty, their automatic presumption that her worth could be measured by her relationship to the men around her. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories, so you never miss these true tales of courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? She forced herself to take another measured sip of coffee, using the motion to scan the room without appearing to do so. 23 personnel present. 17 enlisted, 6 officers, 3 exit routes, 2 potential choke points. The analysis was automatic, a mental muscle that never quite relaxed, even in supposedly safe spaces. The group across the room was warming to their theme. A third SEAL, older and sporting the weathered look of someone who'd seen multiple deployments, leaned back in his chair with the satisfied air of a man about to deliver the killing blow. $10, says she asks one of us about our cool military stories before she leaves, he announced. Loud enough that several other tables turned to look. These civilian contractors are all the same. Think hanging around us makes them special ops adjacent. The assumption landed like a slap. Civilian contractor. It was said with a particular disdain that some military personnel reserved for those they perceived as playing dress-up, as tourists in their world of sacrifice and brotherhood. The irony was so thick Alex could taste it. At the head of the SEAL table sat a man who hadn't participated in the commentary but had been watching it unfold with the detached amusement of someone secure in his position at the top of the food chain. His uniform bore the eagles of a full captain, but more importantly, it bore the gold trident of a SEAL officer and the ribbon stack of someone who'd made a career of walking through doors marked "Authorized Personnel Only." His name tape read Harrison, and everything about his bearing suggested he was accustomed to being the most dangerous man in any room he entered. That assumption was about to be tested. Captain Harrison stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor with deliberate emphasis. The sound cut through the ambient noise like a blade, drawing the attention of everyone in the immediate vicinity. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with graying temples that spoke of years spent in the teams, and the kind of quiet authority that came from leading men in places where mistakes meant body bags. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the particular quality of command that made junior personnel straighten automatically, "I think it's time we introduced ourselves to our guest." The words were polite enough, but the tone carried an undercurrent that made Alex's internal warning systems light up like a Christmas tree. This wasn't going to be a friendly introduction. This was going to be an interrogation. A public performance designed to establish hierarchy and put the outsider in her place. She watched him approach with the kind of calm that came from years of practice at controlling her physiological responses. Heart rate steady. Breathing normal. Hands relaxed. To an outside observer, she looked like any civilian who might be mildly annoyed at being interrupted. Only someone trained to read the subtle signs might notice the way her weight shifted almost imperceptibly forward, the way her free hand came to rest casually near the edge of the table, small adjustments that spoke of preparation, of muscle memory, honed in places where social confrontations could escalate into life or death situations in the span of a heartbeat. Captain Harrison stopped at her table, close enough to loom, but not quite close enough to be overtly threatening. It was a calculated distance, designed to make her feel small without giving her grounds to claim harassment. Behind him, his men watched with the expectant air of an audience settling in for a show. "Good evening, miss," Harrison said, his tone superficially polite but underlaid with steel. "I don't believe I've seen you here before." It was phrased as an observation, but Alex heard it for what it really was. A challenge, an assertion of territory. A demand for justification. She looked up at him, meeting his gaze with the kind of steady eye contact that most people found either intimidating or uncomfortable. Harrison was neither intimidated nor uncomfortable, but something in his expression shifted slightly, as if he'd been expecting a different response. "Evening," Alex replied simply, her voice neutral and giving away nothing. The single word hung between them, loaded with possibility. Harrison had clearly expected more: an explanation, an apology, maybe the flustered protestations of someone caught where they didn't belong. What he got instead was a woman who looked at him like she was measuring him for something and not necessarily finding him adequate. "This is a restricted club," Harrison continued, his voice gaining a slight edge. "Officers and their guests only. I'm going to need to see some identification." Around the room, conversations were beginning to fade as people tuned in to the developing situation. This wasn't unusual SEALs questioning someone's right to be in their space, but there was something about the woman's composure that made it more interesting than the typical tourist stumbles into the wrong place scenario. She wasn't backing down, wasn't showing the appropriate level of deference to a man who was clearly accustomed to immediate compliance with his requests. Alex reached into her pocket with deliberate slowness, her movements careful and visible. In this crowd, sudden gestures could be misinterpreted, and she had no interest in escalating the situation beyond what was necessary. She produced a black leather wallet, extracted a card, and placed it on the table between them. Harrison picked it up, expecting to see a dependent ID, a contractor's badge, Or maybe the kind of fake identification that occasionally surfaced when someone tried to gain access to places they didn't belong. What he saw instead made his confident expression falter for just a moment, a flash of confusion that he quickly masked, but couldn't quite hide. The card was real. Military ID, current, with all the right security features. But it was the details that didn't add up. The rank was wrong too high for someone so young. The clearance level was wrong too high for someone not in uniform. And the unit designation. Harrison's eyes narrowed as he studied the card more carefully, his training kicking in. Something was off. The woman sitting in front of him looked like a civilian contractor, maybe early 30s, with the kind of unremarkable appearance that would let her blend into a crowd anywhere in the world. But the ID told a different story, one that didn't match what his eyes were telling him. "This is interesting," he said finally, his voice taking on the tone of a man who thought he'd caught someone in a lie. He held up the card so his men could see it, though not close enough for them to read the details. "According to this, you're military. But you're not in uniform, and I don't recognize you from any of the commands on base." Behind him, Morrison leaned forward with the eager anticipation of someone about to witness a good takedown. The younger lieutenant was practically rubbing his hands together. This was exactly the kind of thing they lived for, catching someone trying to play in their league when they clearly didn't belong. "Care to explain the discrepancy?" Harrison continued, settling into what was clearly a familiar routine. How many times had he done this before? How many wannabes and posers had he exposed with this same methodical approach? Alex looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost conversational, but there was something underneath it that made the hair on the back of Harrison's neck stand up. "No discrepancy," she said simply. "I'm on leave." The answer was technically correct, but frustratingly incomplete. Harrison felt his irritation growing. This woman was playing games, giving him just enough to avoid outright lying while withholding the information he really wanted. It was the kind of verbal sparring that suggested someone with training, someone who knew how to handle an interrogation. That realization should have been a warning sign. Instead, it just made him more determined to win. Harrison turned the ID card over in his hands like he was examining evidence at a crime scene. His years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now every instinct was screaming that something didn't add up. The woman in front of him was too calm, too composed for someone caught in what should have been an embarrassing situation. Most people, when confronted by a SEAL captain in front of a room full of elite operators, would show some sign of stress, elevated breathing, fidgeting, stammering explanations. This woman looked like she was watching a mildly interesting documentary. "On leave," Harrison repeated, his voice carrying the weight of skepticism. He glanced back at his table, where his men were watching with the expectant attention of wolves who'd caught an interesting scent. "From what unit?" Alex took another sip of her coffee, her movements deliberate and unhurried. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications. She could end this right now. A few words, the right acronyms, and Captain Harrison would find himself in a very different kind of conversation. But something in his posture, in the casual assumption of superiority, made her hesitate. She'd been here before. Different faces, different uniforms, same underlying dynamic. The assumption that she couldn't possibly belong in their world of elite operations and classified missions. The need to prove herself, again and again, to men who took their own belonging for granted. "Classified," she said simply. The single word landed like a challenge. Harrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. In the SEAL community, classified was often code for bullshit, the refuge of wannabes and Walter Mitty types who claimed secret missions they couldn't discuss. Real operators, in Harrison's experience, found ways to communicate their bona fides without violating operational security. "Classified," he repeated, his tone making it sound like a disease. He looked down at the ID card again, then back at her. "Right, and I suppose you can't tell me what you do either?" "Correct." The terseness of her responses was beginning to grate. Harrison was used to controlling conversations, to having his questions answered with the kind of detailed deference that came naturally to people who understood the hierarchy. This woman was giving him nothing. And worse, she was doing it in front of his men. Morrison shifted in his seat, leaning forward with the eager anticipation of a man about to witness his commanding officer dismantle a pretender. The younger Lieutenant Alex had noted his name tape read Kowalski was practically vibrating with excitement. This was better than cable television. "You know what I think?" Harrison said, his voice taking on the tone of a man who'd solved a puzzle. He held up the ID card, angling it so his table could see it better. "I think this is very good fake identification. The kind of thing you can buy online these days if you know where to look." The accusation sent a ripple of tension through the immediate area. Fake military ID was serious business, not just fraud, but the kind of stolen valor that made actual service members see red. Around the room, conversations were stopping as people tuned in to what was becoming an increasingly public confrontation. Alex felt something cold settle in her stomach. Not fear, she'd been through too much to be afraid of a SEAL captain with an attitude problem, but a familiar wariness. The exhaustion that came from having to justify her existence in spaces where her presence was seen as inherently suspicious. "It's not fake," she said quietly. "Prove it," Harrison shot back immediately. "Because right now, all I see is someone who walked into our club with a suspicious ID, claims to be military, but won't say what unit, and is dressed like she's heading to a coffee shop in San Diego. So prove to me that you belong here." The challenge was explicit now. No more polite questioning, no more veiled skepticism. Harrison had made his accusation public, in front of his men, in front of the room. There would be no quiet backing down, no graceful exit. This was a gauntlet thrown, and everyone present understood the stakes. Alex looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. She could feel the weight of the room's attention, the expectant silence of people waiting to see how this would play out. In her peripheral vision, she noticed that the older SEAL, the one who'd made the comment about base groupies, had gone very still, his eyes fixed on her with a different kind of attention than before. "How would you suggest I do that?" she asked, her voice still maddeningly calm. Harrison's confidence surged. This was familiar territory, the moment when the fraud started to crack, when the excuses began flowing. He'd done this dance before with contractors who'd tried to oversell their military experience, with civilians who'd bought surplus gear and thought they could play soldier. "Well," he said, settling into what was clearly a practiced routine, "let's start simple. Every military person has a story, basic training, first duty station, deployment experiences. Hell, even the POGs can tell you what MRE gave them the worst case of the shits." His men chuckled appreciatively. This was the captain they knew, sharp, direct, unafraid to call out pretenders. "So let's hear it," Harrison continued. "Give me something that proves you've actually worn the uniform. Something that shows you've earned the right to flash that ID around." It was a clever trap. Real military personnel could talk for hours about their experiences, the shared misery of boot camp, the peculiarities of different bases, the thousand small details that created the common language of service. But someone with a fake ID would struggle to produce authentic-sounding details, especially under pressure. Alex considered her options. She could tell him about the first time she'd killed someone, about the weight of making decisions that meant life or death for American service members. She could describe the particular way sand got into every piece of equipment during desert deployments, or the sound an RPG made when it passed close enough to your position that you could feel the air pressure change. Instead, she reached for her jacket. The movement was casual, unhurried, but it had an immediate effect on the room's dynamics. Military personnel, especially elite operators, were trained to notice when someone reached for something they couldn't see. Conversations stopped entirely. Harrison's hand moved instinctively toward his side, muscle memory from years of tactical training. Alex draped the jacket over her chair, revealing what she'd been sitting on. It was military issue, but not current, an older pattern that spoke of deployments to places that didn't officially exist on any Pentagon organizational chart. The fabric was worn soft in places, with the particular kind of fading that came from exposure to elements that were harder on equipment than normal field exercises. But it was the patches that made several people in the room take sharp intakes of breath. On the left shoulder was a unit patch that Morrison recognized but couldn't quite place something he'd seen in classified briefings, attached to after-action reports that came with so many redactions they looked like abstract art. The right shoulder bore what was clearly a combat patch, but from a unit so deeply classified that its very existence was compartmentalized. And on the left breast, barely visible against the dark fabric, was a small patch that made the older SEAL at Harrison's table go completely white. "Jesus Christ," the man whispered, his voice barely audible. But in the sudden silence of the room, it carried like a gunshot. Harrison followed his teammate's gaze to the jacket, his confident expression beginning to waver as his brain processed what he was seeing. He was a smart man, a professional who'd spent decades in the special operations community. He knew what those patches meant, even if he couldn't immediately place all of them. What he was looking at wasn't the costume of a wannabe. It was the resume of a professional ghost. "Where did you get that jacket?" he asked, his voice losing some of its earlier authority. Alex looked at him with something that might have been pity. "I didn't get it anywhere, Captain. I earned it." The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Around the room, people were beginning to lean forward, to pay closer attention to a confrontation that had suddenly taken on much higher stakes. This wasn't just about someone trying to gain access to their club anymore. This was about something much more serious, much more potentially embarrassing for the man who'd started the confrontation. Harrison felt the first cold touch of doubt creeping into his certainty. The jacket was real, he could see that now. The wear patterns, the way the patches were sewn on, the dozens of small details that separated authentic gear from the kind of surplus store costume he'd been expecting. But if the jacket was real, if those patches were legitimate. He looked back at her face, really looked this time, trying to see past his initial assumptions. The bone structure was delicate, almost fragile looking, but there was something in her eyes that he'd missed before. A particular kind of stillness that came from spending time in places where movement meant death, where survival depended on the ability to become invisible, to wait, to strike without warning. "Those are some interesting patches," he said finally, his tone more cautious now. "Yes, they are. Care to explain them?" Alex tilted her head slightly, as if considering the question. When she spoke, her voice carried a different quality than before. Not the careful neutrality of someone trying to avoid confrontation, but the measured tone of someone who decided that discretion was no longer necessary. "The 75th Ranger Regiment patch is from my time at Benning," she said conversationally. 3 deployments to Afghanistan, 2 to Iraq. The combat patch is from Task Force 121. You probably know it better by its current designation." She paused, letting that sink in. Task Force 121 was legendary in special operations circles, the kind of unit that existed in the shadows between official military structure and the deepest levels of the intelligence community. Harrison felt his stomach beginning to drop. "The small patch," Alex continued, her voice taking on an almost academic tone, "is from a unit that doesn't have an official name. We called ourselves the Night Riders, but that was just for internal use. Our actual designation was classified above your clearance level, Captain." The insult was delivered with surgical precision. In the SEAL community, clearance level was directly related to operational importance. For someone to casually mention that Harrison's clearance wasn't high enough was tantamount to suggesting that his entire career had been spent in the shallow end of the pool. Morrison was no longer smiling. Kowalski looked like he'd been hit with a brick. The older SEAL who'd gone pale was now staring at Alex with something approaching horror, as if he'd just realized he was looking at a particularly dangerous predator that he'd mistaken for prey. But Harrison was a stubborn man, and his pride had been publicly challenged. Backing down now, in front of his men, was unthinkable. If anything, the revelation that this woman might actually have legitimate credentials made it more important to establish dominance, to prove that his authority in this space was absolute. "Night Riders," he repeated, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Never heard of them." "No," Alex agreed pleasantly. "You wouldn't have." The casual dismissal hit like a slap. Harrison felt his face beginning to flush with anger. This woman, this civilian contractor or whoever the hell she really was sitting in his club, wearing what might or might not be a legitimate military jacket, and talking to him like he was some boot lieutenant who didn't know the difference between a training exercise and a combat deployment. "You know what I think?" Harrison said, his voice rising enough that everyone in the room could hear clearly. "I think you're full of shit. I think you bought that jacket at a surplus store, did some research on unit designations, and thought you could waltz into our club and impress us with your stolen valor bullshit." The accusation hit the room like a physical blow. Stolen valor was fighting words in the military community, not just an insult, but an attack on the very foundation of military honor. Around the room, conversation stopped entirely as people turned to stare at the unfolding confrontation. Alex felt something shift inside her, a familiar cold settling into her bones. It was the same feeling she'd had in a dozen different scenarios, in briefing rooms where her presence was questioned, in forward operating bases where her authority was challenged, in moments when men who should have known better decided that her gender was more important than her rank. She stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. She wasn't tall 5'6" in boots, but something in her bearing made her seem to take up more space than her physical dimensions suggested. Harrison, who'd been feeling confident in his position of authority, suddenly found himself looking at someone who radiated the kind of quiet menace that made experienced operators take a step back. "Stolen valor," Alex repeated, her voice soft but carrying clearly across the now silent room. "That's a serious accusation, Captain." "It's a serious crime," Harrison shot back, doubling down despite the warning signals his training should have been sending him. "And I'm starting to think that's exactly what we're dealing with here." Alex nodded slowly, as if she'd expected exactly this response. She reached for her jacket, and this time, every person in the room tensed. But instead of putting it on, she held it up, displaying the patches more clearly in the room's overhead lighting. "You see this combat patch, Captain?" she asked, her voice taking on the tone of an instructor addressing a particularly slow student. "This isn't from some training exercise in North Carolina. This is from a joint task force that operated out of a base that officially didn't exist, conducting missions that officially never happened, against targets whose names you'll never see on the evening news." She lowered the jacket, meeting Harrison's gaze directly. "And you see this little patch here? The one you think I bought at a surplus store? This represents 18 months of operation so classified that the after-action reports were burned instead of filed. 18 months of walking into places where the life expectancy was measured in minutes, not years." Her voice dropped even lower, but somehow it seemed to fill the entire room. 18 months of doing things that kept people like you safe to sit in clubs like this and question the credentials of people whose sacrifices you couldn't begin to understand. The silence that followed was absolute. Harrison stood frozen, caught between the momentum of his accusation and the growing realization that he'd picked a fight with someone who might be far more dangerous than he'd anticipated. Around the room, people were beginning to process what they'd just heard. Not just the claims anyone could make claims, but the way she'd made them. The casual authority, the specific details, the complete lack of defensiveness that marked someone who'd never had to prove themselves, because their record spoke louder than their words ever could. But most importantly, the older SEAL at Harrison's table had gone from pale to ashen, his eyes fixed on Alex with the expression of someone who just recognized a ghost from a very old, very classified nightmare. And in the corner of the room, partially hidden behind a group of junior officers, a Navy commander was reaching for his phone with hands that shook just slightly as he scrolled through a contact list he hoped he'd never have to use. Because he'd just realized exactly who Captain Harrison was about to ask the question that would end his career. The older SEAL at Harrison's table, Master Chief Petty Officer Dalton, according to his name, Tape pushed back his chair with a scraping sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the frozen silence of the room. 28 years in the teams had taught him to recognize certain things. The difference between bravado and confidence, between training scars and combat scars, between someone who talked about violence and someone who lived with its weight every single day. Right now, every instinct honed over nearly 3 decades of operations was screaming at him that Captain Harrison was about to step on a landmine. "Sir," Dalton said quietly, his voice carrying the particular tone that senior NCOs used when they needed to save officers from themselves. "Maybe we should stand down, Master Chief." Harrison snapped, his eyes never leaving Alex's face. The public nature of the confrontation had pushed him past the point of rational decision-making. In front of his men, in front of the entire club, he'd made an accusation that he couldn't walk back without losing face. "I want to hear more about these mysterious classified missions." Alex looked at him with something that might have been pity. She'd seen this before: good officers, even exceptional ones, who let their pride override their judgment. Men who were so accustomed to being the apex predator in their environment that they couldn't recognize when they'd encountered something more dangerous. "You sure about that, Captain?" she asked, her voice carrying a strange weight. "Because once we start down this road, there's no walking it back." Harrison's jaw tightened. "I'm sure." Alex nodded slowly, as if she'd been expecting exactly that response. She reached into her back pocket and pulled out a phone, not a standard smartphone, but a hardened tactical device that several people in the room recognized as the kind of equipment issued to personnel with very specific security requirements. "Before I make a phone call I'd rather not make," she said conversationally. "Let me ask you something, Captain. You ever hear of Operation Gothic Serpent?" Harrison frowned. The name was familiar, but he couldn't quite place it in the correct context. "Somalia," he said finally. "Early 90s, Task Force Ranger." "Good," Alex said approvingly. "What about Operation Anaconda?" "Afghanistan, 2002. Joint operation in the Shah-i-Kot Valley." "Very good. And Operation Red Wings?" This time Harrison's response was immediate. "Marcus Luttrell, lone survivor. Every SEAL knows that story." Alex nodded. "All famous operations. All public, at least to some degree. All operations that you can read about in books, watch movies about, discuss in polite company." She held up the phone. "The operations I was part of don't have names you'd recognize, Captain. They don't have movies or books or memorial services that make the news." She paused, letting that sink in. "They have graveyards in unmarked locations and families who were told their sons and daughters died in training accidents." The weight of her words settled over the room like smoke. This wasn't bravado or stolen valor bullshit. This was someone speaking about classified operations with the casual authority of someone who'd lived through them, who carried their secrets in the particular way that people carried scars. Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The swagger that had characterized his earlier comments was gone, replaced by the uneasy realization that this confrontation had moved far beyond the simple takedown of a wannabe that he'd expected to witness. Kowalski looked like he wanted to disappear entirely, but Master Chief Dalton was staring at Alex with growing recognition, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, horror, and something approaching awe. Because 30 seconds ago, when she'd mentioned Operation Red Wings, a memory had surfaced, a fragment from a classified briefing he'd attended in 2008, when he'd been read into a compartmented program that dealt with rescue and recovery operations in denied territory. There had been a photo in that briefing, grainy, taken from a distance, showing a figure in non-standard gear moving through terrain that officially didn't exist on any map. The briefing officer had been deliberately vague about details, but he'd mentioned a call sign, a name that had stuck in Dalton's memory because of its unusual nature and the reverent tone with which it had been spoken. Ghost 6. The memory hit him like a physical blow, and suddenly details began clicking into place. The patches on her jacket, the casual mention of Task Force 121, the way she moved, the way she spoke, the bone-deep confidence that came from surviving things that killed other people. "Jesus fucking Christ," Dalton whispered, the profanity slipping out before he could stop it. In the silence of the room, it carried like a gunshot. Every head turned toward him. Harrison looked annoyed at the interruption, but Alex looked interested, as if she'd been waiting for someone to make the connection. "You got something to say, Master Chief?" Harrison demanded. Dalton's mouth opened and closed several times. He looked at Alex, then at Harrison, then back at Alex. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Sir, I think you need to stop talking. Right now." "Excuse me? Sir, with all due respect, I think you need to shut the fuck up and listen to what the lady is trying to tell you." The insubordination was so blatant, so unlike the Master Chief's usual military bearing, that it brought Harrison up short. In 20 years of working with Dalton, he'd never heard the man speak to an officer with anything less than perfect military courtesy. "Master Chief, what the hell, Ghost 6, Dalton said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Sir, if I'm right about who this is, if she's who I think she is, then we need to end this conversation right fucking now before you say something that ruins your career." The name hit the room like an electric shock. Several people recognized it immediately, not from personal experience, but from the kind of whispered stories that circulated in the special operations community like modern legends. Stories about a figure who operated in the spaces between official military structure and the intelligence community, who had a habit of appearing in impossible situations and making the impossible happen. Stories that most people assumed were bullshit. Harrison felt his confidence beginning to waver for the first time since the confrontation had started. Master Chief Dalton wasn't prone to dramatics or exaggeration. If he was showing this level of concern, this level of what looked almost like fear, then something was very, very wrong with Harrison's assumptions about the situation. "Ghost 6, Alex repeated, her voice neutral. "Interesting call sign. Wonder where you heard it." Dalton swallowed hard. "Ma'am, if you are who I think you are, then I owe you an apology on behalf of everyone in this room. And if you're not, then I just made the biggest fool of myself in 30 years of service." Alex studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression, more like the smile a shark might wear if sharks were capable of finding irony amusing. "You were at the briefing," she said finally. "Building 47, Fort Bragg, October 2008. Joint Task Force Orientation for Personnel being read into compartmented programs." Dalton's face went completely white. The briefing she was referring to had been classified at levels so high that acknowledging its existence was a career-ending move. The fact that she knew about it, that she could cite the specific location and date, meant one of two things. Either she had access to intelligence files that were restricted to a handful of people in the entire Department of Defense, or, "You were there," he whispered. "You were the one they told us about. The one who—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence in a room full of people who weren't cleared for the information. Alex nodded slowly. "I was there." The confirmation hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Around the room, people were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented, not just a confrontation between a SEAL captain and a woman he'd assumed was a fraud, but a moment when someone who existed only in classified files and whispered stories had stepped out of the shadows and into their mundane, ordinary world. Harrison felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. Every assumption he'd made, every conclusion he'd drawn, every accusation he'd leveled was beginning to crumble in the face of mounting evidence that he'd picked a fight with someone who operated in realms far beyond his experience. But pride was a stubborn beast, and Harrison was a stubborn man. Even as doubt crept in, even as his Master Chief looked like he was about to have a heart attack, he couldn't quite bring himself to back down. Not yet. Not without something more concrete than whispered names and vague references to classified operations. "Prove it," he said, his voice hoarse. "If you're really this Ghost 6, if you're really some kind of super-secret operator, then prove it." Show me something that convinces me you're not just someone who's done her homework on classified programs. The challenge was desperate now, the last stand of a man who'd realized he was in over his head but couldn't find a way out that didn't involve complete capitulation. Around the room, people held their breath, waiting to see how Alex would respond. She looked at Harrison for a long moment, her expression cycling through what might have been amusement, pity, and something darker. Then she reached for the phone she'd been holding. "You want proof, Captain?" she asked quietly. "You want something that convinces you that I am exactly who Master Chief Dalton thinks I am?" She held up the phone, her thumb hovering over the screen. One phone call. That's all it would take. One phone call to a number that rings in an office you've never heard of, to people whose names don't appear on any organizational chart. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but in the silence of the room it carried to every corner. One phone call, and in 30 minutes there will be people here with credentials that make your clearance look like a library card. People who will be very, very interested in why a SEAL captain decided to publicly accuse one of their assets of stolen valor. She paused, letting the implications sink in. "And then, Captain Harrison, you'll have all the proof you need. The question is whether you'll still have a career to appreciate it." The threat was delivered with such quiet certainty that it sent chills down the spines of everyone present. This wasn't bluster or intimidation tactics. This was someone calmly explaining the consequences of a decision that Harrison was about to make. In the corner of the room, the Navy commander who'd been reaching for his own phone had gone pale. He recognized the tone, the casual authority with which she described a chain of events that would end with careers destroyed and security investigations that would ruin lives. Because he'd just realized that he was looking at someone who had the power to make those threats reality. Harrison stood frozen, caught between his pride and the growing realization that he was facing a choice that would define the rest of his career. Around him, his men waited to see what their commanding officer would do when confronted with evidence that he'd made the kind of mistake that ended careers and destroyed reputations. And in the silence, Alex Chen Ghost 6 waited with the patience of someone who'd spent years learning that the most dangerous weapon in any arsenal was the willingness to wait for your enemy to destroy himself. The moment hung suspended like a held breath, taut with possibility and catastrophic potential. Harrison's face had gone through several color changes, red with anger, pale with dawning realization, and now settling into a sickly gray as the full implications of his situation began to sink in. His hand twitched toward his own phone, some desperate part of his mind already calculating damage control scenarios. Ways to spin this confrontation into something that wouldn't end his career. But before he could reach his pocket, before Alex could dial the number that would bring official attention to this increasingly public disaster, the club's emergency lighting system activated with a piercing electronic shriek that cut through the tension like a blade. Red lights strobed across the room as the base-wide alert system came online, drowning out every other sound with its urgent electronic voice. Condition Bravo. All personnel report to duty stations. This is not a drill. Repeat. Condition Bravo. All personnel report to duty stations. The effect was instantaneous. Every person in the club, regardless of their current state of intoxication or their investment in the unfolding drama, snapped into professional mode. Chairs scraped back, drinks were abandoned, and the casual atmosphere of an evening social club transformed into the controlled chaos of a military unit responding to crisis. But Harrison barely moved. He stood frozen, caught between the immediate demands of his duty and the personal catastrophe unfolding in front of him. His mind was reeling, trying to process too many variables at once. The emergency alert, the woman who might or might not be a ghost from the most classified corners of special operations, and the career-ending mistake he might have just made. Alex, by contrast, had undergone an immediate and total transformation. The casual, almost lazy demeanor that had characterized her throughout the confrontation vanished like smoke. Her posture shifted, spine straighter, shoulders squared, head tilted at an angle that suggested she was processing multiple streams of information simultaneously. Her eyes swept the room with a kind of systematic scan that spoke of training so deeply ingrained it had become reflex. Most telling of all, her hand moved to the phone, not the casual gesture of someone about to make a social call, but the sharp, economical motion of an operator accessing critical communications equipment. "Master Chief," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos with startling authority. "What's the base's current threat posture?" Dalton, who'd been half rising from his chair in response to the alert, stopped dead. The question had been delivered with the kind of casual command authority that suggested someone accustomed to receiving immediate answers to tactical queries. More importantly, it was the right question, not what was happening, but what the base's defensive status meant in terms of immediate threat assessment. "Ma'am, Condition Bravo indicates possible hostile activity within 50 nautical miles," he answered automatically, his 3 decades of training overriding his confusion. "All teams to ready status, all aircraft to Alert 5, all personnel to duty stations pending further assessment." Alex nodded, her fingers already moving across the phone's screen with the kind of speed that suggested muscle memory. "Time since last base security drill?" 18 days, ma'am." "Time since last actual threat condition elevation?" Dalton's eyes widened slightly. 7 months, ma'am." "Iranian fast boats probing the exclusion zone." Alex's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Then this isn't a drill." The words hit the room like a cold slap. Around them, personnel were flowing toward the exits with the kind of organized urgency that spoke of countless hours of emergency response training. But at their table, a small group of elite operators found themselves frozen by the realization that they were witnessing someone conduct a threat assessment with the casual competence of someone who'd done it hundreds of times before, in places where getting it wrong meant body bags. Harrison felt his mouth go dry. The emergency had provided him with a temporary reprieve from the personal disaster of his confrontation with Alex, but it had also given him a front-row seat to watching her operate in crisis mode. And what he was seeing was terrifying in its implications. Because she moved like someone with command authority, not the authority that came from rank or position, but the deeper authority that came from proven competence in life or death situations. She was processing information, making assessments, and issuing informal queries with the kind of natural command presence that suggested someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in the room. Alex's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her expression tightening. "Shit," she murmured, the first crack in her composure since the emergency had started. "Ma'am?" Dalton asked, his voice tight with concern. Alex looked up from the phone, and for just a moment, Harrison saw something flicker across her features. Not fear, exactly, but the kind of focused intensity that came when someone realized that a situation was about to become much more complex. "We have a problem," she said simply. Before anyone could ask what kind of problem, Alex was moving, not toward the exits like everyone else, but toward the club's main window, which offered a clear view of the base's primary aircraft operations area. She pressed herself against the glass, her eyes scanning the tarmac with the kind of systematic intensity that suggested she knew exactly what she was looking for. "Master Chief," she said without turning around, "how many aircraft are supposed to be on the tarmac right now?" Dalton joined her at the window, his own eyes following her gaze. Standard evening configuration would be 12 Hornets, 4 Growlers, 2 Ospreys, and the usual support aircraft. "Why, count them." Dalton's eyes swept across the tarmac, his mental tally growing more concerned with each aircraft he identified. "I count. Shit. I count 11 Hornets. Which one's missing?" "Hard to tell from this distance, ma'am, but looks like one of the birds from VFA 151. "The Vigilantes." Alex's jaw tightened. She pulled out her phone again, this time making an actual call. When it connected, she didn't bother with pleasantries. "It's Ghost 6, she said, her voice carrying the kind of flat authority that suggested the person on the other end would know exactly who she was and why she was calling. "I need an immediate status check on any aircraft that went airborne from Miramar in the last 4 hours. Harrison felt his blood turn to ice. She'd just used the call sign, not as a boast, not as a threat, but as an operational identifier. The casual way she'd said it, the immediate shift into what was clearly a secure communications protocol, suggested that this wasn't some elaborate con game or stolen valor fantasy. This was someone making an operational call to people who knew her by reputation and trusted her judgment enough to provide classified information over an unsecured line. "Confirmed," Alex said after a moment of listening. 1 F-18E Super Hornet tail number 168920 departed Miramar at 1,647 hours on a training flight. Pilot was supposed to return by 1800 hours. It's now 1,852. She paused, listening to something on the other end of the call. When she spoke again, her voice had gone completely flat, the tone of someone delivering bad news with professional detachment. No emergency beacon. No radio contact since 1731 hours. Last known position was approximately 40 nautical miles southwest of the base, conducting low-level navigation training over water. Harrison felt his stomach drop. A missing aircraft, especially one that had gone dark during what should have been routine training, was every commanding officer's worst nightmare. But what was terrifying him more was watching Alex process this information with the kind of systematic calm that suggested someone accustomed to dealing with crisis situations that were far more complex than a single missing aircraft. "Copy that," Alex said into the phone. "Stand by." She ended the call and turned to face the small group of SEALs who'd been watching this unfold with growing horror. When she spoke, her voice carried the kind of authority that made senior NCOs stand straighter automatically. "Gentlemen, we have a situation. One of your aircraft is missing, pilot status unknown, last known position in waters that are currently experiencing unusually high levels of what intelligence assessment suggests might be hostile activity." She paused, her eyes sweeping across their faces. "The good news is that search and rescue protocols are already in motion. The Coast Guard has been notified, and standard procedures are being followed." Her expression hardened. "The bad news is that standard procedures probably aren't going to be enough." Dalton found his voice first. "Ma'am, what do you mean?" Alex walked back to the window, her eyes fixed on something beyond the tarmac. 40 nautical miles southwest. That puts the aircraft's last known position right on the edge of the shipping lanes that connect to the port of Long Beach. Busy area, lots of commercial traffic, lots of opportunities for things to get complicated quickly. She turned back to face them. "It also happens to be an area where we've been tracking increased activity from assets belonging to certain state actors who have an interest in testing our response capabilities and gathering intelligence on our search and rescue procedures." The implication hit the room like a physical blow. Harrison felt his knees go weak as he processed what she was suggesting, that the missing aircraft might not be the result of mechanical failure or pilot error, but the result of hostile action by foreign intelligence services. "You're saying," he began, then trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "I'm saying that there's a pilot out there who might need help that goes beyond standard Coast Guard search and rescue capabilities," Alex replied. "And I'm saying that time is a factor in ways that most people in this room probably don't want to think about too carefully." She walked back to her table, picked up her jacket, and began putting it on with movements that were sharp and economical. As she did, more of the patches became visible unit designations and operational awards that told the story of someone who'd spent years working in the shadowy spaces between official military structure and intelligence operations. "Master Chief," she said as she adjusted the jacket, "I need you to contact your commanding officer. Tell him that Ghost 6 is requesting immediate consultation regarding the missing aircraft situation." Dalton swallowed hard. "Dalton, ma'am, I'm not sure I have the authority to—" "You don't," Alex interrupted, "but the call sign does. Trust me on this one." She finished with the jacket and turned to face Harrison, who was still standing frozen in the middle of what had started as a social confrontation and had transformed into an operational crisis that was far beyond his experience. "Captain," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of authority and what might have been pity. "I suggest you contact your chain of command as well, because in about 10 minutes, people are going to start asking questions about base security, about how a hostile actor might have gained access to information about training flight schedules, and about whether there are any gaps in our operational security that might have contributed to this situation." Her eyes met his, and Harrison saw in them the cold calculation of someone who'd spent years dealing with threats that most people couldn't imagine. "And when those questions start getting asked," she continued, "you're going to want to make sure that everyone in your chain of command understands that you've been fully cooperative with the asset who's been brought in to help resolve this situation." The word asset hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Not consultant, not liaison, not advisor. Asset. The kind of word that intelligence agencies use to describe human resources whose capabilities were considered essential to mission success. Harrison felt the last of his defiance crumble. Whatever game he'd thought he was playing, whatever confrontation he'd thought he was winning, had just revealed itself to be something far more serious than his pride or his reputation. This was about a missing pilot, about potential hostile action, about the kind of crisis that ended careers and cost lives. And standing in front of him, wearing patches that told the story of operations he'd never be cleared to know about, was someone who might be the difference between bringing that pilot home alive and explaining to a family why their son or daughter wasn't coming back. "What do you need from us?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Alex smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the smile of someone who'd just heard exactly the response she'd been waiting for. "Right now, Captain, I need you to stay out of my way and let me do my job. But in about 20 minutes, when the people I work for start arriving, I need you to remember this conversation and be prepared to explain to them why you thought it was a good idea to publicly accuse me of stolen valor in front of a room full of witnesses." The threat was delivered with such casual certainty that it sent chills down Harrison's spine, because he was beginning to realize that this woman, whoever she really was, had the power to destroy his career with a single phone call, and the only thing standing between him and professional annihilation was her willingness to focus on the missing pilot instead of his catastrophic failure of judgment. Alex pulled out her phone again, but this time she paused before making the call. "Oh, and Captain," she added, her voice carrying a note of dark amusement, "for future reference, when someone tells you they can't discuss their unit assignment because it's classified, and when that someone is wearing patches you don't recognize, and when a 30-year Master Chief tells you to shut up and listen," she held up the phone, her thumb hovering over a contact that Harrison was beginning to realize would connect her to people whose authority made his rank look like a merit badge. "Next time, shut up and listen." The phone call that followed was unlike anything Harrison had ever witnessed. Alex didn't dial a number from memory or scroll through contacts. Instead, she activated what appeared to be an encrypted communications app, spoke a brief authentication phrase in what sounded like Arabic, and was immediately connected to someone who clearly had been expecting her call. "This is Ghost 6, she said, her voice taking on the clipped, professional tone of someone delivering an operational briefing. "I need immediate tasking authority for SAR operations in Grid Square 7543. We have a missing F-18 with pilot status unknown, last contact 1731 hours, suspected hostile interest in the operational area." She paused, listening to something on the other end of the call. Around her, the small group of SEALs watched in stunned silence as she conducted what was clearly an operational coordination call with people who had the authority to redirect military assets in real time. "Confirmed," she continued. "I'm requesting immediate deployment of a specialized recovery team with underwater search capabilities and authorization to cross into international waters if necessary. Time is critical. If we're dealing with what I think we're dealing with, we have maybe 90 minutes before this becomes a much more complex problem." Harrison felt his mouth go dry. Whatever authority Alex possessed, it was sufficient to request the deployment of military assets for a search and rescue operation that clearly went far beyond standard procedures. The casual way she'd mentioned crossing into international waters suggested that she was operating under authorities that superseded normal command structures. "Roger that," Alex said after another pause. "I'll coordinate with local assets, and I need you to contact SOCOM and let them know that Ghost 6 is active on this operation. If anyone has questions about my authority, they can direct them through the usual channels." She ended the call and immediately began dialing another number. This time, when it connected, her voice took on a different quality, still professional, but with an undertone that suggested she was speaking to someone she knew personally. "It's me," she said simply. "I need a favor." The contrast was startling. One moment, she'd been speaking to what was clearly an official chain of command with the formal language of military operations. Now she was speaking to someone with the casual intimacy of personal relationship. "I've got a missing pilot situation off the coast of California," she continued. "Standard SAR is already in motion, but I think we're dealing with something that requires a more specialized approach. Can you have your people in the area conduct a discreet survey of the search area? I'm particularly interested in any unusual surface or subsurface activity." She listened for a moment, nodding at something the caller was saying. "I know it's short notice," she said, "and I know you're not technically supposed to operate in those waters without proper authorization. But if I'm right about this, proper authorization is going to take too long, and we're going to lose a pilot who doesn't deserve to die because of bureaucratic bullshit." Another pause. Then she smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth Harrison had seen from her all evening. "Thanks, John. I owe you one." Again. She ended the call and looked up to find every person in the immediate area staring at her with expressions that ranged from confusion to dawning horror. "Master Chief," she said, her voice returning to its operational tone, "I need you to contact your base operations center and tell them that specialized search assets are being deployed to augment the standard SAR operation. They should expect coordination calls from assets that may not be immediately recognizable through normal channels." Dalton nodded slowly. "Ma'am, can you give me any guidance on how to explain this to my command?" Alex considered the question for a moment. "Tell them that Ghost 6 is coordinating additional search assets under existing operational authorities. If anyone needs clarification on what that means, they can contact the duty officer at SOCOM." She paused, then added, "And Master Chief, tell them that time is critical. If we don't find this pilot in the next hour, we're looking at a situation that's going to require resources and authorities that nobody in this room wants to think about." The ominous tone of her words sent chills through everyone present. Harrison found himself wondering what kind of scenarios Alex was considering that would require resources beyond what was already being deployed. As if reading his thoughts, Alex turned to face him directly. "Captain, you're wondering what I'm so worried about. Let me paint you a picture." Her voice took on the tone of an instructor delivering a tactical briefing. "You've got a military aircraft that disappeared in an area where foreign intelligence assets have been conducting increased surveillance operations. You've got a pilot who may or may not be alive, who definitely has access to classified information, and who represents a high-value target for anyone interested in gathering intelligence on American military capabilities." She paused, letting the implications sink in. "Now, if this is just a mechanical failure or pilot error, then standard search and rescue procedures will work fine. The Coast Guard will find wreckage, we'll recover what we can, and we'll write a report that explains what went wrong." Her expression hardened. "But if this is something else, if someone decided to test our response capabilities by taking down one of our aircraft, then we're looking at a situation where a pilot is in the hands of people who have very specific ideas about how to extract information from American military personnel." The implications hit the room like a physical blow. Harrison felt his stomach drop as he processed what Alex was suggesting. Not just the loss of an aircraft, but the potential capture of an American pilot by hostile forces operating in what should have been secure airspace. "Ma'am," Morrison said, his voice tight with concern, "are you saying you think the pilot was shot down?" Alex shook her head. I'm saying I don't know what happened. And in situations like this, you plan for the worst-case scenario while hoping for the best. Right now, the worst-case scenario is that we have an American pilot in the hands of people who shouldn't have been able to operate in that area without us knowing about it. She pulled out her phone again, this time accessing what appeared to be a real-time intelligence feed. And the reason I'm concerned, she continued, her eyes scanning whatever information was appearing on her screen, is that this kind of operation, taking down a military aircraft in a way that doesn't immediately trigger massive retaliation, requires very specific capabilities and very specific intelligence about our operating taking down procedures. She looked up from the phone, her expression grim. The kind of capabilities and intelligence that suggest state-level involvement. The words hit the room like a bomb. State-level involvement meant foreign governments, intelligence agencies, the kind of threats that existed in the shadows between official military confrontation and covert operations. Harrison felt his legs go weak. The confrontation that had started as a simple question about Alex's credentials had somehow evolved into a discussion of potential acts of war by foreign intelligence services. Jesus Christ, he whispered. Alex's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her expression tightening. We just got confirmation, she said, her voice flat. Satellite imagery shows debris field approximately 42 nautical miles southwest of Miramar. No emergency beacon activation, no radio contact, no ejection seat deployment detected. She paused, processing the implications. Either the pilot went down with the aircraft, or someone doesn't want us to know the pilot survived. Dalton found his voice first. Ma'am, what's our next move? Alex was already moving toward the exit, her stride purposeful and urgent. Our next move, Master Chief, is to get to that debris field before anyone else does. Because if I'm right about what happened, then we're in a race against people who have a very strong interest in getting to that pilot before we do. She paused at the door, looking back at the small group of SEALs who'd been watching this unfold. And gentlemen, she added, her voice carrying a weight that made everyone present understand that they were witnessing something that would define their careers. If we lose this race, then we're looking at a situation that's going to make tonight's little misunderstanding seem like a pleasant memory. With that, she was gone, leaving behind a room full of elite operators, who were beginning to understand that they'd just witnessed someone step out of the shadows of the most classified corners of American military operations and into a crisis that might determine whether an American pilot lived or died. Harrison stood frozen, his mind reeling as he tried to process the full scope of what had just happened. An hour ago, he'd been a SEAL captain, enjoying a quiet evening at his club. Now, he was potentially a witness to an act of war. And the woman he'd accused of stolen valor was coordinating a response that involved authorities and capabilities he'd never even known existed. His phone rang. When he answered it, the voice on the other end belonged to his commanding officer, and the tone suggested that Harrison's evening was about to become much more complicated. Captain Harrison, the voice said, tight with controlled urgency. I need you to report to base operations immediately. We've got a situation, and apparently you've been in contact with someone who has information we need. Harrison felt the last of his certainty crumble. Yes, sir. On my way. As he headed for the door, Master Chief Dalton fell into step beside him. Sir, Dalton said quietly, for what it's worth, I think you should know that Ghost 6, the real Ghost 6, has a reputation for bringing people home. If anyone can find our pilot, it's her. Harrison nodded, unable to speak past the knot in his throat, because he was beginning to realize that the woman whose credentials he'd questioned, whose honor he'd attacked, whose very existence he doubted, might be the only thing standing between an American pilot and a fate that didn't bear thinking about. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more inspiring military stories like this one. The Base Operations Center at 2,100 hours looked like a scene from a techno-thriller movie. Banks of monitors displayed real-time satellite feeds, communication arrays crackled with encrypted traffic, and personnel from multiple agencies moved with the kind of controlled urgency that spoke of a crisis unfolding in real time. Harrison arrived to find the center transformed from its usual nighttime skeleton crew operation into a full-scale command post. Officers from SOCOM, representatives from the Coast Guard, and personnel he didn't recognize, wearing civilian clothes but carrying themselves with the bearing of people accustomed to operating in classified environments. At the center of it all, surrounded by maps and displays showing the search area, stood Alex Chen. She was no longer the woman in civilian clothes who'd been sitting quietly in the Officers Club. The casual demeanor had been replaced by the focused intensity of someone coordinating a complex operation under time pressure. She moved between workstations with the kind of efficient authority that suggested someone accustomed to being the senior decision-maker in crisis situations. More importantly, everyone in the room, regardless of their rank or agency affiliation, was deferring to her. "Sir, over here," Master Chief Dalton called out, gesturing Harrison toward a corner of the room where the base commanding officer, Captain Rodriguez, was standing with a group of senior staff. Rodriguez looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past hour. When he saw Harrison approaching, his expression tightened with a mixture of annoyance and concern. "Captain Harrison," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the particular tone that commanding officers used when they were about to deliver very bad news. "I understand you had an encounter with our consultant this evening." Harrison felt his stomach drop. The way Rodriguez said "consultant" suggested that Alex's role in the evening's events had been discussed at length, and that those discussions had not been favorable to Harrison's professional reputation. "Yes, sir," Harrison replied carefully. "Care to explain why one of my SEAL officers thought it was appropriate to publicly accuse a Department of Defense asset of stolen valor?" The question hit like a physical blow. Asset. Not consultant, not contractor, not liaison. Asset, the kind of designation reserved for intelligence personnel whose capabilities were considered critical to national security operations. "Sir, Harrison began, then trailed off, realizing that there was no explanation for his actions that wouldn't make him sound like an incompetent fool. Rodriguez studied him for a moment, then gestured toward the center of the room where Alex was coordinating the search operation. "That woman, Captain, is one of 12 people in the entire Department of Defense who are authorized to coordinate cross-agency operations involving multiple classified programs. She holds security clearances that are classified above your level, operates under authorities that supersede normal command structures, and has a track record of success in operations that officially never happened." Rodriguez paused, letting that information sink in. "She also happens to be the reason we might actually bring our missing pilot home alive." As if summoned by their conversation, Alex looked up from the workstation where she'd been coordinating with what appeared to be satellite operators. She caught sight of Harrison and Rodriguez, nodded briefly in their direction, then walked over with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested someone with limited time and unlimited authority. "Captain Rodriguez," she said, her voice carrying the brisk efficiency of operational coordination, "I need to brief you on our current situation." Rodriguez straightened slightly. "Go ahead." Alex activated a tablet she'd been carrying, displaying what appeared to be real-time satellite imagery of the search area. "We've confirmed debris field location and have assets en route for detailed reconnaissance. Initial assessment suggests catastrophic structural failure of the aircraft, but the pattern of debris distribution is inconsistent with mechanical failure or pilot error." She expanded the image, highlighting specific areas of the debris field. "You can see here that the debris pattern suggests external impact. Something struck the aircraft with sufficient force to cause immediate structural failure. The pilot had no time to activate emergency procedures, no time to send a distress signal, no time to deploy countermeasures." Rodriguez leaned forward, studying the imagery. "Are you saying the aircraft was shot down?" "I'm saying the evidence is consistent with hostile action," Alex replied. "But more importantly, I'm saying that we have approximately 45 minutes before this situation moves beyond our ability to control it quietly. She switched to a different view, showing the broader operational area around the debris field. We've identified 3 surface vessels in the immediate area that weren't there this morning. All 3 are flagged as belonging to a shell company that our intelligence assets have linked to foreign intelligence operations. They're moving toward the debris field at maximum speed. The implications hit the room like a bomb. Foreign intelligence assets were already responding to the downed aircraft, moving to reach the scene before American search and rescue operations could secure the area. "Ma'am," Harrison found himself saying, "what are we dealing with here?" Alex looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that suggested someone delivering information that would change everyone's understanding of the situation. "Captain, what we're dealing with is a sophisticated intelligence operation designed to capture an American pilot and extract classified information about our operational capabilities. The aircraft wasn't randomly targeted, it was specifically selected because of the pilot's security clearance and access to information about our advanced avionics systems." She paused, then continued with the kind of clinical precision that made the horror of the situation even more stark. "The hostile vessels that are responding aren't conducting a rescue operation. They're conducting a recovery operation. They want the pilot alive, but only long enough to extract whatever intelligence value they can before disposing of a witness to an act of war." The room fell silent except for the hum of electronic equipment and the distant sound of aircraft taking off. From the base's runways, everyone present was processing the implications of what Alex had just described, not just the loss of an aircraft, but an act of war disguised as an accident, conducted in American territorial waters. Rodriguez found his voice first. "What's our response?" Alex smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the smile of someone who'd been waiting for exactly that question. "Our response, Captain, is why I'm here." She activated a different screen on her tablet, showing what appeared to be a real-time tactical display with multiple moving icons representing various assets. "I've coordinated the deployment of assets from 3 different agencies, operating under authorities that allow us to respond to this situation without the bureaucratic delays that would normally be required for operations involving foreign nationals in disputed waters." She pointed to specific icons on the display. "We have a specialized maritime recovery team en route via helicopter, an attack submarine that was conducting exercises in the area and has been redirected to our operational zone, and air assets that are officially conducting routine training exercises but are actually establishing a defensive perimeter around our search area." Rodriguez stared at the display. "How did you coordinate all of this so quickly?" Alex's expression didn't change. "Because this isn't the first time we've dealt with this particular threat, and because the people I work for have been planning for exactly this scenario for the past 18 months. The casual revelation that this operation had been anticipated, planned for, and was now being executed according to predetermined protocols sent chills through everyone present. This wasn't a crisis response, this was the implementation of a strategy that had been developed by people who operated in realms far beyond normal military planning." "Ma'am," Master Chief Dalton said, his voice tight with concern, "what can we do to help?" Alex looked around the room, her gaze settling on each person present, with the kind of assessment that suggested someone calculating variables and possibilities. "Right now, the most important thing you can do is exactly what you're doing. Stay out of the way and let the people who are trained for this kind of operation do their job. But in about 20 minutes, when we start bringing people back, we're going to need medical personnel, security personnel, and administrative support for what's going to be a very complicated debrief process." She paused, then looked directly at Harrison. "And Captain, we're going to need someone who can coordinate with the base's security personnel to ensure that what happened here tonight doesn't become a topic of casual conversation in the barracks or the officers' club." The implication was clear. Harrison's earlier confrontation with Alex had taken place in front of multiple witnesses, and those witnesses were going to need to understand that what they'd observed was classified at levels that made casual discussion a career-ending mistake. "Yes, ma'am," Harrison replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Alex's tablet chimed with an incoming communication. She glanced at the screen, her expression tightening. "We've got movement," she announced to the room. "Our maritime recovery team has reached the debris field and has located the pilot." A collective intake of breath filled the room. Everyone leaned forward, waiting for the next update. Alex listened to something through an earpiece, her face cycling through expressions of concentration, concern, and finally something that might have been relief. "Pilot is alive," she announced. "Injured but conscious, floating in a survival suit approximately 200 meters from the main debris field. Recovery is in progress." The room erupted in subdued cheers and expressions of relief, but Alex held up a hand for silence. "That's the good news," she said. "The bad news is that the hostile vessels have accelerated their approach. They're now approximately 15 minutes out from the debris field, and they're jamming our communications." She looked around the room, her expression grim, "which means we're about to find out whether our response capabilities are sufficient to handle a direct confrontation with foreign intelligence assets in American territorial waters." Harrison felt his blood run cold. The situation had just escalated from a search and rescue operation to a potential armed confrontation between American military forces and foreign operatives. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said. "What are your orders?" Alex looked at him with something that might have been surprise. "My orders, Captain, are classified above your clearance level. But what I can tell you is that in about 10 minutes, you're going to see demonstrations of American military capabilities that officially don't exist, conducted by personnel who officially aren't there, in response to actions that officially never happened." She paused, then added with dark humor, "And if anyone asks you about it later, you're going to tell them that you observed a routine training exercise that went exactly according to plan." The next 15 minutes passed like a fever dream of controlled chaos and technological capabilities that seemed to exist in the realm of science fiction rather than military reality. On the main display screen, real-time satellite footage showed the drama unfolding in the waters off the California coast. The American recovery team, moving with the kind of precision that spoke of extensive training in exactly this type of operation, had successfully retrieved the pilot and was moving toward what appeared to be a submarine that had surfaced just long enough to provide emergency medical assistance. But the foreign vessels were closing fast, their aggressive approach pattern suggesting that they had no intention of allowing the Americans to complete their mission unchallenged. "Hostile vessels are now 12 minutes out," Alex announced to the room, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone coordinating operations under fire. "They've deployed what appears to be fast attack craft. An intelligence assessment suggests they're armed with anti-ship missiles and boarding equipment." Harrison watched in stunned silence as Alex orchestrated a response that involved assets he'd never known existed. Calls were made to numbers that weren't listed in any official directory. Orders were given using protocols that didn't appear in any manual. Resources were deployed with authorities that superseded normal command structures. It was like watching someone conduct a symphony orchestra. If the orchestra was composed of the most lethal military assets in the American inventory, and the music being played was the kind of violent confrontation that could escalate into international incidents. "Air assets are in position," Alex announced after listening to something through her earpiece. "We have 2 F-22 Raptors maintaining overwatch at 30,000 feet, officially conducting routine training exercises. We also have an AC-130 Spectre gunship that's officially not there, providing precision fire support capabilities if the situation escalates." Rodriguez stared at her in amazement. "How did you get authorization for all of this so quickly?" Alex looked at him with an expression that suggested the question revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how her world operated. "Captain, the authorization for this response was signed 18 months ago by people whose names you don't know, based on intelligence about threats you're not cleared to access." What happened tonight isn't a crisis that required improvised solutions. It's the implementation of a strategy that was developed by people who knew this day was coming. She paused, then added with dark satisfaction, "The only question was whether our response would be fast enough and precise enough to prevent what could have been a major intelligence coup for our adversaries." On the display screen, the situation was reaching its climax. The American submarine had submerged with the rescued pilot, disappearing beneath the surface just as the first hostile fast attack craft reached the debris field. The foreign operatives found nothing but empty water and debris from an aircraft that had already been stripped of anything with intelligence value. But more importantly, they found themselves surrounded. "Jesus Christ," Master Chief Dalton whispered, watching as what appeared to be empty ocean suddenly revealed itself to be full of American military assets that had been waiting in concealment for exactly this moment. Surface ships emerged from behind the horizon, moving with the coordinated precision of a pack of wolves converging on their prey. Aircraft appeared on radar screens as if materializing from thin air. Submarine contacts that had been invisible moments before announced their presence by surfacing in positions that made it clear the foreign vessels were completely surrounded. "Hostile vessels are requesting permission to withdraw," Alex announced, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction that suggested someone watching an enemy walk into a carefully prepared trap. "They're claiming they were conducting routine search and rescue operations in international waters." She paused, listening to something through her earpiece. "Permission denied. They're being boarded by Coast Guard personnel for inspection of their search and rescue credentials." Harrison felt his jaw drop. What he was witnessing wasn't just a successful rescue operation, it was a masterpiece of strategic deception that had turned what could have been a major intelligence disaster into a demonstration of American military capabilities that would send very clear messages to anyone considering similar operations in the future. "Ma'am," he found himself asking, "how long have you been planning this?" Alex turned to look at him, and for the first time since the crisis had begun, her expression softened slightly. "Captain, I haven't been planning this. The people I work for have been planning this. My job was simply to be in the right place at the right time to implement a response that had been developed by analysts and strategists whose job is to think about threats that most people hope they'll never have to face." She paused, then added with something that might have been humor, "Although I have to admit, I didn't expect to be implementing it after spending the evening being accused of stolen valor by a SEAL captain who couldn't recognize an intelligence asset if she was wearing a sign." The comment hit Harrison like a physical blow, but not because of its sarcasm, because of its accuracy. He had failed to recognize someone whose presence in his club should have been a warning sign that events far beyond his experience were unfolding in his area of responsibility. More importantly, he had allowed his assumptions about gender and military capability to override his professional judgment, nearly compromising an operation that had potentially saved American lives and prevented a major intelligence loss. "Ma'am," he said, his voice tight with shame, "I owe you an apology." Alex studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that suggested someone who'd had this conversation before, in different circumstances, with different people who'd made similar mistakes. "Captain, you don't owe me an apology. You owe your profession an apology. You owe every person who's ever worn the uniform an apology. Most importantly, you owe yourself an apology, because tonight you allowed prejudice to override training, and that's not the kind of mistake that good officers make." The words hit like hammer blows, each one driving home the magnitude of Harrison's failure. But before he could respond, Alex's tablet chimed with another incoming communication. She listened for a moment, her expression cycling through relief, satisfaction, and finally something that looked like professional pride. "Recovery complete," she announced to the room. "Pilot has been transferred to advanced medical care and is expected to make a full recovery. Intelligence assessment of the aircraft debris has confirmed that no classified systems were compromised. Hostile vessels have been escorted out of American territorial waters after thorough inspection, revealed equipment consistent with intelligence-gathering operations. She paused, then looked around the room at the assembled personnel who'd been watching this operation unfold. Operation has been completed successfully, with no American casualties and no compromise of classified information. All agencies involved have performed according to the highest standards of professionalism and competence. The formal language of after-action reporting couldn't hide the magnitude of what had just been accomplished. A complex, multi-agency operation had been planned, coordinated, and executed in real time, resulting in the successful rescue of an American pilot and the defeat of a sophisticated intelligence operation conducted by hostile foreign assets. And it had been accomplished by someone who, 3 hours earlier, Harrison had accused of being a fraud. Captain Rodriguez stepped forward, his expression cycling through amazement, relief, and what looked like professional admiration. "Miss Chen," he began, then paused, clearly uncertain about proper protocol for addressing someone whose rank and authority existed in realms he didn't fully understand. "Alex," she corrected gently, "or Ghost 6, if you prefer operational designations." Rodriguez nodded. "Ghost 6, on behalf of every person at this base, I want to express our gratitude for your actions tonight. You've saved a pilot's life, prevented what could have been a major intelligence disaster, and demonstrated capabilities that, well, that frankly exceed anything I thought was possible." He paused, then stepped back and rendered a salute so sharp, so precise, that it seemed to cut through the air itself. "Ma'am, it has been an honor to witness you in action." The effect was immediate and electric. Every person in the room, regardless of rank, service branch, or agency affiliation, snapped to attention and rendered salutes that spoke of profound respect earned through demonstrated competence under the most extreme circumstances. Master Chief Dalton's salute was held longer than regulation required. His 30 years of experience recognizing someone who operated in realms far beyond his own considerable expertise. The Coast Guard representative saluted with the respect of people who understood that coordination between agencies often failed catastrophically, but who had just witnessed it work with clockwork precision. The civilian personnel from various intelligence agencies rendered salutes with the kind of professional admiration reserved for someone whose operational capabilities had just exceeded theoretical planning. And Captain Harrison, standing in the center of the room, rendered a salute that carried the weight of profound shame for his earlier actions and even more profound respect for someone whose competence had been demonstrated in the most unforgiving arena possible. Alex stood in the center of this display of respect, her expression cycling through surprise, acknowledgement, and finally a quiet dignity that spoke of someone accustomed to operating in shadows but deeply moved by public recognition. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone whose actions had earned the right to be heard. "Thank you," she said simply. "But what happened tonight wasn't the result of individual competence. It was the result of institutional capability, the ability of American military and intelligence assets to work together when the stakes demand nothing less than perfection." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room. "Everyone in this room played a crucial role in bringing our pilot home alive. The only difference is that some of those roles are classified at levels that prevent public recognition." Her eyes found Harrison's. "Captain, your Master Chief's recognition of potential threats, your base operations personnel's coordination of logistics, your security personnel's maintenance of operational security, all of that was essential to mission success." She paused, then added with something that might have been forgiveness. "Mistakes in threat assessment happen to everyone. What matters is learning from them and ensuring they don't happen again when lives are on the line." The salutes were lowered with the kind of precision that spoke of deep respect, but the emotional weight of the moment lingered in the room like smoke from an explosion. Harrison stood in the center of it all, processing the magnitude of what he'd just witnessed and the even greater magnitude of his own failure to recognize it from the beginning. As the immediate aftermath of the conference, operation began to wind down, personnel returning to their stations, communications equipment being secured, reports being filed in systems he'd never heard of. Alex began gathering her materials with the efficient movements of someone preparing to return to whatever shadows she'd emerged from. Harrison watched her, his mind racing through the events of the evening, trying to understand how someone he'd dismissed as a civilian contractor had revealed herself to be one of the most operationally capable people he'd ever encountered. More importantly, he was trying to understand how his own prejudices and assumptions had led him to make the kind of catastrophic error in judgment that could have compromised an operation involving American lives. "Ghost 6, he said, his voice carrying across the room with enough authority to draw everyone's attention. Alex looked up from the tablet she'd been securing, her expression neutral but attentive. Harrison took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to say would be heard by everyone present and would become part of the unofficial record of the evening's events. "Ma'am, I need to make something clear, both for the record and for everyone in this room who witnessed my actions tonight." He paused, gathering his thoughts, then continued with the kind of formal precision that military personnel used when making statements of official importance. "When you entered the Officers Club this evening, I made assumptions about your presence based on factors that had nothing to do with your qualifications, your authority, or your operational capability. I allowed prejudice to override professional judgment, and I publicly questioned the credentials of someone whose competence has just been demonstrated at the highest possible level." His voice strengthened as he continued, the shame of his actions driving him to complete honesty. "I accused you of stolen valor without conducting proper verification of your identity. I challenged your right to be present in a military facility without following appropriate protocols for addressing security concerns. Most significantly, I allowed personal bias to interfere with my ability to recognize a Department of Defense asset whose presence should have been treated as an indicator of operational activity, requiring my immediate attention and support." The room was completely silent, except for the hum of electronic equipment. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented, a senior military officer delivering a public acknowledgement of professional failure that went far beyond simple mistakes in judgment. Harrison continued, his voice taking on the weight of someone delivering testimony that would be remembered long after the immediate crisis had passed. "The failure was not in my initial caution about an unfamiliar person in a secure facility. The failure was in my assumption that gender and civilian clothes indicated lack of military capability. The failure was in my decision to conduct a public confrontation rather than a private verification. The failure was in my inability to recognize competence that should have been obvious to any professional with my level of experience." He paused, then looked directly at Alex. "Ma'am, you have every right to file a formal complaint about my conduct. You have every right to demand disciplinary action for behavior that fell far below the standards expected of a naval officer. You have every right to ensure that this incident becomes part of my official record and affects my future assignments and promotion opportunities." Alex studied him for a long moment, her expression cycling through what might have been surprise, assessment, and finally something that looked like professional respect for someone willing to accept full responsibility for their actions. When she spoke, her voice carried the measured tone of someone who'd given considerable thought to her response. "Captain Harrison, what happened tonight was a failure of threat assessment, not a failure of character. You made assumptions that led to poor decisions. But when presented with evidence that contradicted those assumptions, you adapted your position and provided support for an operation that saved American lives." She paused, then continued with something that might have been understanding. "The intelligence community is full of people who've made similar mistakes. The difference between those who succeed and those who fail isn't the absence of errors in judgment, it's the ability to learn from those errors and ensure they don't compromise future operations." Her expression softened slightly. "What I saw tonight was someone who recognized his mistake, acknowledged it publicly, and took immediate action to correct it. That's not the behavior of someone who lacks character. That's the behavior of someone who understands that operational success requires the ability to admit error and adapt to changing circumstances." Harrison felt something ease in his chest. though the weight of his shame remained. Alex wasn't excusing his behavior, but she was offering him a path forward that didn't involve the complete destruction of his career. However, Alex continued, her voice taking on a harder edge, what happened tonight also highlights some significant gaps in institutional awareness that need to be addressed. She looked around the room, her gaze settling on each person present. The fact that a Department of Defense asset could spend an entire evening in a military facility without being recognized suggests that our operational security protocols may not be as effective as they need to be. The fact that someone with my level of clearance and authority could be challenged by base personnel without triggering appropriate verification procedures suggests that our identification and authentication systems have room for improvement. Her voice took on the tone of someone delivering an operational assessment that would result in policy changes. Most importantly, the fact that assumptions about gender and military capability nearly compromised recognition of intelligence assets suggests that we have training and awareness issues that need to be addressed at the institutional level. Captain Rodriguez stepped forward, his expression that of someone receiving guidance from a subject matter expert. Ghost 6, what would you recommend? Alex considered the question for a moment, then responded with the kind of systematic analysis that spoke of extensive experience in operational assessment and improvement. First, I recommend enhanced training for all base personnel on recognition and verification of intelligence assets operating under non-standard cover. Personnel need to understand that Department of Defense assets often operate in civilian clothes with minimal identification and with authorities that may not be immediately apparent through normal channels. She paused, organizing her thoughts. Second, I recommend implementation of discrete verification protocols that allow base personnel to authenticate unusual presences without compromising operational security or creating public confrontations that could compromise ongoing operations. Her voice took on additional authority. Third, I recommend comprehensive review of assumptions and biases that may affect threat assessment and recognition of friendly assets. Tonight's incident could have compromised a time-sensitive operation because of assumptions that had nothing to do with actual security concerns. Rodriguez nodded, clearly taking mental notes on recommendations that would become official policy. And finally, Alex continued, her gaze finding Harrison's. I recommend that this incident be used as a training case study for senior personnel, with emphasis on the importance of verification procedures, the dangers of assumption-based threat assessment, and the critical nature of proper identification of intelligence assets. She paused, then added with something that might have been mercy, the case study should focus on procedural improvements rather than individual failures, with the goal of ensuring that similar situations are handled more effectively in the future. Harrison felt a wave of gratitude so intense it was almost overwhelming. Alex was offering him a chance to turn his catastrophic error in judgment into a positive contribution to institutional improvement, a way to ensure that his mistake became a learning opportunity that prevented similar failures by others. "Ma'am," he said, his voice tight with emotion, "I want you to know that I'll do everything in my power to ensure that this incident results in meaningful improvements to our procedures and training." Alex nodded acknowledgement, then began gathering her materials again, her movements suggesting that she was preparing to return to whatever operational environment she'd emerged from. But before she could leave, Harrison felt compelled to ask one final question, not for himself, but for the sake of everyone in the room who'd witnessed something that existed far beyond their normal experience. "Ghost 6, he said, "can you tell us anything about what happens next? About whether operations like this are going to become more common? About whether we should expect to see more intelligence assets operating in our area?" Alex paused, her hand resting on the tablet case she'd been packing. When she looked up, her expression carried the weight of someone who understood implications that extended far beyond the immediate operation. "Captain, what happened tonight is part of a much larger pattern of activity that represents a fundamental shift in how our adversaries are choosing to test our capabilities and gather intelligence about our operations. The fact that foreign intelligence assets felt confident enough to attempt an operation in American territorial waters suggests that they believe they understand our response capabilities well enough to calculate acceptable risk levels. Her voice took on a darker tone. The fact that they were wrong about those calculations will make them reconsider their approach, but it won't make them abandon their objectives. If anything, tonight's demonstration of our capabilities will prompt them to develop more sophisticated methods for achieving the same goals. She paused, then looked around the room with an expression that suggested someone delivering information that would change how everyone present understood their role in national security. So, yes, Captain, you should expect to see more intelligence assets operating in your area. You should expect to encounter personnel with authorities and capabilities that don't fit into normal organizational structures. Most importantly, you should expect that the threats we're facing are becoming more sophisticated, more aggressive, and more willing to take risks that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. Her gaze found Harrison's one final time, which means that the stakes for getting threat assessment right are going to continue to increase, and the margin for error is going to continue to decrease. With that sobering assessment, Alex Chen Ghost 6 gathered her materials and walked toward the exit. Her stride purposeful and unhurried, leaving behind a room full of military personnel who understood that they'd just witnessed something that would change how they understood their profession for the rest of their careers. Harrison stood in the center of the room, processing the weight of responsibility that came with the knowledge that his actions could have compromised operations involving life and death, and understanding that the evening's events had marked a fundamental change in how he would approach every aspect of his professional duties. Because he'd learned that in the shadow world where Ghost 6 operated, the stakes were higher, the threats were more sophisticated, and the margin for error was measured in American lives. 3 weeks later, Captain Harrison stood at the podium in the base's main briefing auditorium, looking out at an audience of officers and senior NCOs from every command on Miramar. The presentation slides behind him displayed a sanitized but comprehensive analysis of what was now officially referred to as the Ghost 6 incident, a case study in threat assessment, operational security, and interagency cooperation that had become mandatory training for all senior personnel. The primary lesson, Harrison said, his voice carrying to every corner of the auditorium, is that assumptions based on appearance, gender, or civilian dress can compromise our ability to recognize friendly assets and respond appropriately to operational requirements. He clicked to the next slide, which displayed a flowchart of proper verification procedures that had been developed in consultation with intelligence agencies whose existence most of the audience wasn't cleared to know about. When confronted with an unfamiliar person in a secure facility, the appropriate response is discreet verification through established channels, not public confrontation based on personal assumptions about who does or doesn't belong in our operational environment. The training program had been his idea, developed in consultation with Captain Rodriguez and approved by commanders whose authority extended far beyond the base itself. It was comprehensive, mandatory, and designed to ensure that no one else would make the mistakes that had nearly compromised a classified operation. More importantly, it was his attempt to transform his failure into something that strengthened institutional capability rather than simply serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of prejudice. The secondary lesson, Harrison continued, is that the nature of threats facing our installations has evolved beyond traditional models of hostile activity. We must be prepared to encounter friendly assets operating under non-standard cover, hostile assets using sophisticated deception techniques, and situations that require coordination with agencies and authorities that exist outside normal military command structures. He paused, scanning the audience of professionals who would be responsible for implementing these lessons in their own commands. What happened 3 weeks ago was successful because personnel at every level adapted quickly to changing circumstances, supported operations they didn't fully understand, and maintained operational security despite the unusual nature of the activities they were witnessing. In the back of the auditorium, Master Chief Dalton nodded approvingly. The training program Harrison had developed was exactly the kind of practical, experience-based education that translated into improved performance under stress. More importantly, it transformed a potentially career-ending incident into a genuine contribution to institutional capability. Harrison clicked to the final slide, which displayed contact information for various agencies and departments that could provide verification of personnel operating under unusual authorities. The ultimate lesson is that in an environment where threats are becoming more sophisticated and friendly assets are operating under increasingly complex cover, our first responsibility is to verify, not to assume. Our second responsibility is to support operations that serve national security interests, even when those operations exist outside our normal experience. He paused, then looked directly at the audience with the kind of intensity that suggested someone delivering information based on hard-won personal experience. And our third responsibility is to remember that the people who operate in the shadow world of classified programs are Americans who have made sacrifices for national security that most of us will never fully understand. They deserve our respect, our support, and our commitment to the kind of professionalism that ensures their operations succeed. The applause that followed was respectful and sustained, but Harrison barely heard it. His mind was focused on a conversation he'd had 2 days earlier when Alex Chen had called to provide input on the final version of the training program. "You've done something important here," she'd said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who understood that institutional change was often more valuable than individual recognition. "This kind of training will prevent similar incidents and probably save lives." She'd paused, then added something that had stayed with him since. "The hardest part of my job isn't the operational stuff that's just training and practice and good planning. The hardest part is explaining to people who live in the normal world why the shadow world exists and why it matters. You found a way to build that bridge, and that's something that will have value far beyond what happened between us." Harrison finished his presentation and watched as the audience filed out, officers and NCOs discussing the implications for their own commands and responsibilities. But his attention was drawn to a figure in the back of the auditorium who'd been sitting quietly through the entire presentation. Captain Rodriguez approached the podium as the last of the audience departed. "Outstanding work, Captain," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying genuine appreciation. "This training program is already being requested by other commands, and I'm getting inquiries from agencies that want to use it as a model for inter-service cooperation protocols." Harrison nodded acknowledgement, but his attention remained focused on the figure in the back of the auditorium who was now approaching the front of the room. It was Alex Chen, dressed in civilian clothes but moving with the same purposeful stride that had characterized her actions during the crisis 3 weeks earlier. She looked exactly as she had that evening in the Officers Club, unremarkable, professional, the kind of person who could blend into any environment without attracting attention. "Ghost 6, Harrison said, his voice carrying profound respect. "Alex," she corrected with a slight smile. "I'm not operational at the moment." Rodriguez looked between them, clearly uncertain about protocol for a conversation involving someone whose authority existed in realms he didn't fully understand. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said finally, "to what do we owe the pleasure?" Alex reached into her jacket and pulled out a folder marked with security classifications that made both officers straighten slightly. "I wanted to deliver this personally," she said, handing the folder to Rodriguez. "It's the official after-action report from our operation 3 weeks ago, along with commendations for base personnel who provided critical support during the incident." Rodriguez opened the folder carefully, his eyes scanning documents that were clearly classified above his normal clearance level. "Ma'am, this is comprehensive," he said finally. "It's thorough," Alex agreed, "and it specifically notes the exceptional performance of Captain Harrison, both during the operational phase and in the development of training protocols that have already been adopted by multiple commands." Harrison felt his chest tighten with emotion. After weeks of wondering whether his career would recover from the incident, Alex was delivering official recognition for his efforts to transform his mistake into institutional improvement. There's also this. Alex continued, pulling out a second document that bore the seal of agencies Harrison didn't recognize. A formal request for Captain Harrison to serve as a liaison officer for operations involving joint agency coordination in the Southern California area. It's a collateral duty assignment that would involve periodic consultation on situations requiring coordination between traditional military assets and specialized capabilities. Harrison stared at the document. She was offering him a role in the shadow world she operated in, not as an operator, but as someone who could help bridge the gap between normal military operations and the classified programs that existed to handle threats most people never knew about. "Ma'am, I'm honored," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're qualified," Alex replied simply, "and more importantly, you've demonstrated the ability to learn from mistakes and turn failures into improvements. That's exactly the kind of capability we need in people who interface between the classified and unclassified worlds." She paused, then looked at both officers with something that might have been satisfaction. What happened 3 weeks ago started as a failure of threat assessment. It ended as a demonstration of how quickly military personnel can adapt to unusual circumstances when they understand what's at stake. The training program that resulted from it has already prevented similar incidents at other installations. Her voice took on additional weight. "Well, sometimes the most valuable contributions to national security come from people who make mistakes, acknowledge them honestly, and work to ensure others don't repeat them." Alex began walking toward the auditorium exit, but paused at the doors for one final comment. "Captain Harrison, if you accept the liaison position, you should know that it will occasionally require you to explain to other officers why someone who looks like a civilian contractor might actually be one of the most operationally capable people they'll ever encounter." She smiled, the first genuinely warm expression Harrison had seen from her. "I have confidence that you're uniquely qualified for that kind of conversation." With that, she was gone, leaving Harrison standing at the front of an empty auditorium, holding documents that would change the trajectory of his career and his understanding of the role military professionals played in the broader spectrum of national security operations. Rodriguez clapped him on the shoulder. "Captain, it looks like your evening in the Officers Club is going to have longer-lasting consequences than either of us expected." Harrison nodded, his mind already processing the implications of working in the space between traditional military operations and the shadow world where Ghost 6 conducted her missions. "Yes, sir," he replied. "And I think that's exactly where I need to be." 3 months later, Harrison was coordinating his first joint operation involving traditional military assets and specialized capabilities, working with personnel whose names didn't appear on organizational charts to address threats that wouldn't make the evening news. The operation was successful, the threat was neutralized, and American interests were protected by people whose sacrifices would never be publicly recognized. And in his office, prominently displayed next to his military awards and commendations, hung a framed copy of the training manual. He developed a reminder that sometimes the greatest contributions to national security came from people who'd learned to recognize competence regardless of the package it came in. Because he'd learned that, in a world where threats were becoming more sophisticated and responses required capabilities that existed in the shadows, the most important skill any military professional could develop was the ability to recognize allies, respect expertise, and support operations that served interests larger than personal pride or institutional prejudice. The stories of people like Ghost 6, who operated in the shadows to protect freedoms most Americans took for granted, reminded him daily that true professionalism meant understanding that competence could come from unexpected sources, and that the greatest honor any military officer could achieve was the trust of warriors whose battles were fought in places that officially didn't exist. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more military and veteran stories. These true tales keep the courage alive for generations to come. And in the comments, tell us, where are you watching from, and who's the quiet leader you'll never forget.